I would urge all of you as journalists, there's no one who has a bigger megaphone than each of you. I know many news organizations are interested in other things right now. I know you all are passionate about foreign affairs. You're all passionate about world events and humanitarian situations across the world. There is no better advocate for what is going on and shining a spotlight on the horrors that are taking place in Eastern Ghouta than each of you. If I can implore you, and I know you do this anyway as part of your jobs, talking to your editors, talking to your producers, saying this is important, this is something we've got to cover, now is the time to cover it. So many people have come to us saying, what is the United States doing about the situation in Eastern Ghouta? What can we do? The answer to that is we can shine a spotlight on that. That is what I'm attempting to do right now. That is what the government is attempting to do. And I hope you will be a part of that, shining the spotlight on that. I want to thank Elise last night. She had included me in seeing a documentary. I'm not supposed to encourage people to go see things or do some things, but I don't care. I'm going to break that rule because I think it's just that important. A documentary last night called The Last Men in Aleppo. And it was about the situation in Aleppo, Syria. And in there, you saw the humanitarian disaster. You saw these selfless men who were leaving their families every day to go try to save those who were buried in the rubble or who had been victims of attacks. That situation is being replicated today in Eastern Ghouta. We don't have to see this happen this way. Shine a spotlight on it. Let the world know exactly what is happening. We will back you in this. I will assist you in any way I can in helping you to shine a spotlight on this important issue. Elise, go right ahead. And I'd also like to mention one of your other colleagues who moderated the panel yesterday from Al Arabiya. So.
أو مسعفين يجوا لهون يساعدوا الناس.
لا ما يساعدوا الناس، هسه شيلوا الجرحى شيلوا هيك.
ولا بس كان يساعد دفاع مدني، كان في دفاع مدني يساعد. No, there is no not.
بيشيلوا ركام شغلات الجرحى يطلعون من هذا ويكون في تحت المسلحين، يعني المسلح بالدرجة الأولى. المدني
armed groups the first priority.
But did they help civilians? And what were the hospitals being used for? And were the terrorists preventing them from leaving?
Yes.
How?
They used to shoot at us. And the one who killed those families are from Nusra Front.
في لهم كان صار في موجودين يشتغلوا معهم، يشتغلوا أحيانا مع المدنيين، يشتغلوا أحيانا غالبا كان الحقيقة بيستنى الوضع كانت هي جبهة النصر.
It's early morning and they're planning an attack. Their way of defending East Aleppo is to hit back by sending suicide bombers to the Syrian army.
They don't help people. They only work when there is a camera on them, and when the camera is gone, they leave. They abandon people under the rubble. They told us to pull the bodies out by ourselves.
The complaints, but the allegations got more serious. This man accused the organization of intentionally killing his little girl.
I took her to the Civil Defense hospital, and they gave her an injection filled with air to kill her.
Ever see in Fardous men with white helmets? They're called the white helmets of the Civil Defense, helping people when they were injured.
When they came to help the injured, they stole from them. If people were wearing jewelry, they cut it off. All of them are thieves.
Some of them are honest, but many are just thieves. They see gold and they take it.
جبهة النصر وإن كان مقر لحاله من هالشكل على المدرسة العزامية.
المدرسة هي أساسا مقر للمسلحين كان، بعدين اجى الدفاع المدني بنى فيها.
А вот еще один пример исламистской символики. Хотите сказать, что ее наклеили после того, как отсюда ушли с поста?
ولا حنادين ولا بس مسلحين. Only
And were they treating any civilians?
نتركوه يمشوا. في كم مستوصفات يروحوا عليهم بس ما هي معالجة يعني المعالجة اللي كنا ناخذها. أنا لحد الآن إيدي مصوبة لك مثلا يعني.
On something that Sarah Flounders mentioned, which is that today in the General Assembly, the representative of my country, Canada, is raising or has raised a resolution which is not about human rights. It's not about the people of Syria. It's a resolution meant to point fingers and to vilify the governments of Syria and Russia. And this resolution relates to a UN Security Council resolution that was vetoed by Russia and China some days ago. That resolution pertained to another useless ceasefire in Syria, which would have no bearing on, bring no good to the people of Syria, and which follows a week of liberation of areas of Aleppo, which now amounts to about 95% of areas of Aleppo that have been occupied for years by terrorist factions. So at this time, when 100,000 civilians in these areas occupied for years by terrorist factions have been liberated, the UN, parties in the UN wanted to impose another ceasefire. And I want to remind people why these ceasefires are indeed pointless. The last ceasefire in September was from the very start negated by 20 main terrorist factions who declared they were not going to participate, and from the very beginning violated the ceasefire over 300 times during the duration of the ceasefire. And not only these terrorist factions, while the Syrians and while the Russians adhered to the tenets of the ceasefire, but the American-led coalition itself violated the ceasefire by targeting Syrian army positions in Deir ez-Zor, killing at least 83 Syrian soldiers, in a prolonged attack that lasted nearly 1 hour and which enabled ISIS to overtake that position. So this is one reason why a ceasefire is pointless at this point in time. There is no faith that any of the parties that the US and Western leaders who have funded these terrorists, there's no faith that they can actually control the terrorists and get them to adhere to a ceasefire. And the people of Aleppo want Aleppo to be completely freed. And I speak having been to Aleppo 4 times, and this is the will of people in Aleppo. So on that note, I'd just like to talk about briefly, I've been to Syria 6 times since 2014, 2 of which were with international delegations, and 4 times were independently on a visa I applied for, paid for, and waited for. My trips have been self-funded or fundraised, and I've gone at my own risk and been able to travel freely in the country to areas I wish to travel to. I've been many times to Homs, to Malula, to Latakia, Tartus, Siath, Sweda, and again, Aleppo 4 times. And I mention these because I think it's important people realize I have, wherever I've gone, I've spoken in Arabic to the people I'm speaking with. What Donna, what Sarah have said, that the people support their army and government is absolutely true. Whatever you hear in the corporate media is the complete opposite. And on that note, what you hear in the corporate media, and I will name them, BBC, Guardian, New York Times, etc., on Aleppo is also opposite of reality. Aleppo since 2012 has been inhabited by different terrorist factions, among them al-Nusra, among them the so-called Free Syrian Army, which has committed the same heinous acts of terrorism as al-Nusra, as ISIS, as Ahrar al-Sham, as Nuruddin al-Zinki, which beheaded a 12-year-old Palestinian child, and somehow is still deemed moderate. Since 2012, these areas of Aleppo, which have now recently been freed, their occupation by these terrorist factions has meant the greater Aleppo, the 1.5 million plus population of greater Aleppo have suffered sieges denying them food and medicine. They've suffered for years a want of electricity and water, and they've suffered daily bombardment by these terrorists of mortars, of gas canister bombs, which are improvised and made locally, of water heater bombs, which are even more powerful and can level floors of entire buildings, of conventional weapons like Grad rockets supplied by the West, and etc. As I said, they've suffered these attacks on a daily basis, and even now, because there are still Western-backed terrorists in pockets of Aleppo, there are still mortars and gas canister bombs raining down, and people are still dying in Aleppo. This is another reason why the liberation and securing of these areas is imperative, because that will actually bring peace to Aleppo. Now, my colleagues here mentioned the nature of unity in Syria and the fact that Syrians see themselves first as Syrian before any sect. This is an important point because our media and the Gulf media has made Syria out to be sectarian, which is something the Syrians themselves have denied. But it's a tool to make people confused. It's a tool to make people believe that it's Sunnis against Bashar al-Assad, when in fact, bear in mind that Aleppo is overwhelmingly Sunni and is with the government and is with the army and is suffering from the terrorists who declare that they are liberating the city in Syria. Other points about Aleppo are hospitals in Aleppo have been attacked. I'm sure you've heard in the media that hospitals have been attacked. Well, this media is referring to the pockets of Aleppo that were occupied by terrorists. And they have manufactured stories, and I can give you a precise account. In April of this year, there was a hospital called the Al-Quds Hospital, which in a concerted effort, all media said was attacked and targeted and badly damaged by either the Syrians or the Russians. In fact, the Russians had satellite imagery showing that this hospital was in the same shape that it was in October 2015. No difference. Therefore, it was not attacked. Months later, The Guardian, which is a prominent British newspaper, actually said the Al-Quds hospital that it had alleged months prior to be attacked and destroyed was treating victims of so-called chemical weapons attacks. So even the media that is lying is inconsistent in their lies. But there have been hospitals attacked. I went to the Al-Dabit hospital, which is in Aleppo City. It's a maternity hospital. It was attacked on May 3rd, and 3 women were killed. You would think this would be something raised at the UN or by so-called human rights groups, but it was not. In December 2013, the Kindi hospital was attacked and destroyed. It was the largest and best cancer treatment hospital in the Middle East. It was destroyed by al-Nusra terrorist truck bombings. And in fact, in recent media reports on Aleppo, again alleging Syrian or Russian strikes on hospitals, Fox News actually had the audacity to use a photo of Al-Kindi hospital and allege that this is in eastern areas of Aleppo and that this hospital had been attacked by Syrian or Russian strikes. This goes to show how much the media has been lying from the very beginning about Syria and continues to lie. When I went to Aleppo, I spoke with the Aleppo Medical Association. They comprise 4,160 active and registered doctors. More lies in the media have said the last doctor in Aleppo, the last pediatrician in Aleppo. Of these over 4,000 doctors, 800 of them are specialists. So you can see that when the media talks about Aleppo, it's talking about areas that were occupied by terrorists. And it's completely negating the suffering and the will of the Syrian people in Greater Aleppo. When I was in Aleppo in July, I got a taste of some of the bombings by these terrorist factions. There was an explosion about half a kilometer away at Hatat Baghdad, and I don't know how many people were killed that day, but it was close enough that it was a massive plume of smoke. About 5 minutes later, an explosive bullet fired from an area occupied by terrorists landed about 15 meters away from where I was. If it had hit parked cars, I wouldn't be here speaking. A day later, a good friend of mine, his mother was killed by one such explosive bullet. So this is just a small taste of what people are suffering on a daily basis. In November, when I was there with a delegation of Western journalists, including from the New York Times, LA Times, BBC, etc., on November 3rd, there were a series of attacks throughout the day with Grad missiles, explosive vehicles, and other explosive bullets and snipings. By the end of the day, 18 people, civilians, were murdered and over 200 were injured, including critically. We were at the Al-Razi hospital, which is one of the main hospitals, and we saw the maimed people pour in. And this was just one day of many of endless days in Aleppo. On November 4th, we were at the Castello Road humanitarian crossing. This was a day that was meant to allow the people in eastern areas of Aleppo that were inhabited by terrorists to evacuate. And this was not the first time. On prior occasions, the Syrians and the Russians had opened 8 humanitarian corridors to enable people to leave. These were attacked by terrorist factions heavily. Even that day on November 4th, the Castello Road crossing was attacked, twice with mortar shelling when we were there and 5 times afterwards. Clearly, there has been political will and intent by the Syrian government and its Russian allies to enable civilians to leave, to minimize any sort of loss of human life. Clearly, the terrorists that declare themselves liberators of Syria do not want people to leave. They've been holding civilians hostage. And if you're following reports that are not BBC and that are not New York Times, you will see countless testimonies of civilians, of the 100,000 civilians who've been liberated the last week, saying, thank God for the Syrian Arab Army that liberated us, and the terrorists were hoarding food, they were preventing us from having food. This is all documented. Also documented are that areas in these areas occupied by terrorists, including a school, were housing chemicals used to make chemical weapons. And you could see also the gas canisters that were used to make explosive gas canister bombs. In fact, even when I was in Lebanon, we saw a factory in one of the buildings that was used to make gas canister bombs. In Lebanon, we also saw evidence of the so-called Free Syrian Army that some people say doesn't exist anymore. The 16th Brigades was active there. They had a cell underground, 3 stories below, that was perfectly intact in spite of aerial bombings above ground. And I make this point because people talk about the destruction in Aleppo as if the physical destruction matters. It's the people that the Syrian government and the Syrian people care about. And the destruction in areas occupied by terrorists occurs because the terrorists are bunkering below ground, come up above ground, fire their bombs on civilian populations, and go back below ground. So I just want to address a few other myths. Some of the myths that have been about Aleppo and Syria in general have been that the Syrian government and army are starving the population. Again, I refer to testimonies of people, even people I met with in November. I met with a family of displaced people from Al-Halak, which is north of Bustan al-Pasha, which was an area, both areas occupied by terrorists. At that time, when I met them on November 10th, he told me that they had fled along with about 40 others on about 20 days prior, and that they had tried twice prior to flee, but they were prevented violently so from doing so by the terrorists that inhabited those areas. This is the case. These are the testimonies coming out of Aleppo now. People saying, we tried to flee, they wouldn't let us, they shot at us. There are also videos showing people who did manage to flee coming under fire and the Syrian army actually protecting them, acting as human shields. So that's to say that what we've been hearing in the corporate media is not depicting an accurate image of what's happening in Aleppo. the corporate media is saying that the Syrian army is attacking people, and until today, the corporate media is maintaining this, even though the exact opposite is true. I would ask you to follow the voices of people in Syria who, like my colleagues here said, they want you to speak the truth. They're tired of lies. They're very well aware of the lies that our media is purporting and that our human rights groups are purporting. They want an end to the violence. They don't want this war to continue. They didn't ask for this war. But as my colleagues stressed, Syria is a sovereign nation. It has the right to fight against terrorism. And we know that 101 of 193 UN member states have sent terrorists to Syria to slaughter and destroy. So Syria is fighting a war against terrorism. It's winning in Aleppo, and hopefully either the terrorists will accept a deal to be transported out of Aleppo, hopefully they will participate in the Musalaha, the reconciliation, will lay down their arms, will take the amnesty offered to them by the government and which has been taken by thousands of former militants. And hopefully, above all, the U.S. will stop supporting terrorism and stop funding terrorism. And hopefully this new bill will take fire, will be supported, and actually it will be impossible to fund an armed mercenaries from FSA, Ahrar al-Sham, Nuruddin al-Zinki, and all the colors in between, because they're all the same terrorists. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Very informative. Thank you very much. Now we are open to questions, if there are questions. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Christopher Ronneberg with the Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten. A question for, or two questions for Ms. Bartlett here. As a journalist, I'm sure you can appreciate getting other impressions than empirical impressions from the ground. When you talk about the Syrian people and what the Syrian people want, how can you quantify that? Do you have any independent surveys where you can actually document that? And secondly, you talk about the corporate media, the Western media, the lies, and all of this. Could you explain what you think might be the agenda from us in the Western media, and why we should lie, why the international organizations on the ground should lie, why we shouldn't believe all these absolutely documentable facts that we see from the ground, these hospitals being bombed, these civilians who are talking about the atrocities that they have been experiencing. How can you justify calling all of us liars?
Sure.
Thank you.
I mean, there are certainly honest journalists amongst the very compromised establishment media. Let's start with your second question. So, international organizations on the ground. Tell me which ones are on the ground in eastern Aleppo. Yeah, okay, I'll tell you, there are none. There are none. These organizations are relying on the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in Coventry, UK, and which is one man. They're relying on compromised groups like the White Helmets, which, let's talk about the White Helmets. The White Helmets were founded in 2013 by a British ex-military officer. They have been funded to the tune of $100 million by the US, UK, and Europe, and other states. They purport to be rescuing civilians in eastern Aleppo and Idlib, yet no one in eastern Aleppo has heard of them. And I say no one, bearing in mind that now 95% of these areas of eastern Aleppo are liberated. The White Helmets purport to be neutral, yet they can be found carrying guns and standing on the dead bodies of Syrian soldiers. And their video footage actually contains children that have been recycled in different reports. So you can find a girl named Aya who turns up in a report in month, say, August, and she turns up in the next month in 2 different locations. So they are not credible. The SOHR is not credible. Unnamed activists are not credible. Once or twice, maybe, but every time, not credible. So your sources on the ground, you don't have them. As for your agenda, not your, but the agenda of some corporate media, it is the agenda of regime change. How can the New York Times, I was reading it this morning, or how can Democracy Now!, which I was reading the other day, maintain until this day that this is a civil war in Syria? How can they maintain until this day that that the protests were unarmed and nonviolent until, say, 2012? That is absolutely not true. How can they maintain that the the Syrian government is attacking civilians in Aleppo, when every person that's coming out of these areas occupied by terrorists is saying the opposite. So that's with regards to your question on lying Western media. How do I quantify the support of the Syrian people? The elections. In 2014, the Syrian people held elections. The voter turnout was 88%, including people in Lebanon, where I was during the elections in Lebanon, which were actually ran for 2 days, extended hours, people walking for kilometers to reach the embassy, including people who flew from their own countries like mine, which has criminally shut the Syrian embassy so that Syrian people have no rights, and including people within Syria who braved a torrent of terrorist mortars and missiles on election day. And yet, voter turnout rate was something like 88%, I believe. And then the election, the results were 78, I believe. I think
Tim Anderson gives you the opposite.
Okay, I might get the turnout wrong. So the results.
74 was the participation.
74 participate, 88. Okay. Anyway, the point being, overwhelmingly, the people support President Assad. That's based on elections, based on my own travels. Okay, so that's subjective. But as I said, I've traveled around Syria, talked with people of all faiths, all walks of life, and there are people that want change in the government. We're not pretending they don't want change. Everybody wants change. But in terms of support of the government, the point is they don't see President Assad as the problem. They see the problem as terrorism. They see elements of problems in the system that they have there. But President Assad, they don't see as the problem. They actually overwhelmingly support him. So I'm basing it on their choice in their leader, and I'm basing it on my interactions with people in Syria and Lebanon.
State Department. You know, they talk about the CNN being the Clinton News Network. Now, the White House, State Department, is getting all the news networks to shine a spotlight on propaganda. It's not just my words, friends. Let me tell you something. Like I said, I'm an American. I love my country. And when it comes to humanitarian crisis, I care about those lives that are being lost as well. But are you aware that the majority of the so-called white helmets, Syrian Civil Defense Team, which there is a real Syrian Civil Defense Team, and it's not the white helmets. Most of these are not even Syrians. They have been brought in from other countries. Let's take a look. Let me share with you what really is going on. This here is Henry Lohendorf. And it's a little bit lengthy what you're going to listen to here, but it is important that you hear Henry out. This was back in 2015 or 2016, a delegation of Peace Corps movements, different individuals, heads, presidents, etc., all went to Syria. In fact, you can see here you have Alfred. I can't think of Alfred's last name. We have Alfred, right?
Pure luxury.
Sorry. I got the commercial attached to it. There's the, whoop, there we go. Hang on. I just want to quickly so you can see. This is the delegation right here. This is Alfred. This is Henry Lohendorf. I forget the names of these ladies here. All 5 of these, including this man here, were part of a peace group movement that went to Syria to do a fact-finding mission to find out what was going on. They reported this to the United Nations. There are a handful of reporters, including some others that are in the room there. One reporter totally stunned by what he was hearing here. And you're going to see why, because I think that Henry Lohendorf really puts the true emphasis on what they saw there. Keep in mind, none of these people that went were funded for this. Neither by the government, neither by their organization. They were self-funding. The Syrian government didn't pay them a dime. Nobody. They wanted to see, as humanitarians, what was really going on. And this, of course, was because of the situation in Aleppo as well. All right? Let's listen to a little bit about what Henry actually says in this video here. Let me find the right place to start it.
Propaganda.
Back it up just a little bit.
What she is seeing as she investigates further the truth of what's happening in
I believe is Ava Bartlett. I don't remember for sure, but I think he's talking about Ava Bartlett.
What Alfred said is so true. We are fighting a mass of propaganda that has demonized The Syrian government demonized its leaders, an effort that precedes every other intervention that the United States has made over the course of many, many decades in order to convince people that it's okay for quote-unquote humanitarian reasons to overthrow a government and to replace it with whatever. The United States prefers a government that is not independent, that is a willing participant in what the
That's the shocked reporter.
policy is.
I got to hear his question. He was shocked.
In Damascus, and what we saw in the 2 villages we visited outside Damascus belies the propaganda that has overwhelmed us. It's hard. It's hard for even those of us who have been in the peace movement for a long time. It's hard for us to ignore this propaganda. It is so well orchestrated. We spoke to members of industry, the Chamber of Industry. We spoke to leaders in the student union, the National Student Union. We spoke with NGOs that are involved in taking care of the orphans of those who have died in this war on both sides. They don't discriminate.
I'm going to fast forward just a little bit. He's going to talk about all the different groups that they've met with here, but to save time, we'll go back to a little bit further down in the video here.
The damage. We saw villages that are basically Christian villages that have been besieged by the terrorists but have now been liberated. And the damage done to a shrine in a village called Malula, which is a village where they still speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus, and the attacks on the Christian population. One of the things I bring back, there are 2 things I want to mention finally that we feel are really important. One is that while the United States would like to divide the Syrians up by religion or within a religion by the different beliefs within that religion, there wasn't a Syrian we talked to who would accept that. We spoke to the Grand Mufti and he said, people ask me how many Muslims there are in Syria, and his response is always 23 million. That's the population of Syria. And when we talked to the bishop of one of the Orthodox churches, he answered the same thing. The number of Christians is 23 million. We will not allow ourselves to be divided up the way the United States has divided up the people of Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan or so many other countries. We won't allow that. And that unity, I believe, has led to the ability of the Syrians to withstand an invasion by the most powerful country in the world and its most powerful allies in Europe, its most powerful allies in the Middle East, with what is a vicious attack on the Syrian people. The second is the sanctions. I have to admit that I did not know before I went that the United States has imposed sanctions on Syria in a way that's similar to the sanctions that the United States imposed on Iraq in the 1990s in order to weaken that country and that government that the United States admits killed 500,000 children in Iraq during the 1990s sanctions. That set of sanctions means that the Syrian people cannot get medicines that they desperately need. They cannot get factory parts that they need to maintain their economy. They can't get infant formula and many other things. Their students...
Think about that. They can't get infant formula. They can't get medicine. Children are dying of different diseases because of these things. is this what we're doing to Russia, and is this what we're doing to North Korea? I mean, granted, you have to understand, friends, I am definitely not for North Korea with the nuclear weapons that they have and wanting to attack the United States. But have we lost our humanity as Americans? We talk about the humanitarian crisis in East Ghouta, but you have to remember, and you're going to find out tonight, the Syrian Civil Defense, neither Al-Qaeda, neither al-Nusra, or the other 3 terrorist groups that are fighting inside of East Ghouta right now against Damascus, trying, you have to understand, the U.S. and their allies are backing the collapse of Damascus, even according to, as the scripture says in Isaiah 17, Damascus will fall. But at what price? The stronghold of Ephraim will also collapse with it, which is the Christian community. Will collapse because Syrian government is taken out. Yeah, why? Because as Henry Lohendorf points out, they had visited the Christian communities that had been under siege and under attack by the U.S., NATO, and their Middle Eastern allies were attacking and killing these Christians. The man was there. He's an American. Most of the delegation are Americans. It's not just Steve Benoon that says these things. All right? Now, let's take a deeper look at what's going on. As I mentioned, the State Department wants to shine a spotlight on this group that they say, oh, we can't tell you, we can't support it, it's going outside of what we're supposed to do, but I want to shine a spotlight. But they made sure it was the white helmets that they want to shine the spotlight on. Isn't it interesting that it's more about what the white helmets are doing to quote-unquote save lives? What about the true Syrian Civil Defense team that saves lives unequivocally, whether they're Syrian or not? Not in the case of what you're about to find out. Newsweek, mainstream media, June 22nd, 2017, Syria's white helmets, subject of Oscar-winning film, caught dumping dead soldiers. Let me make it clear. Mutilated dead soldiers. All right? And more than one Syrian Civil Defense team member, if I'm not mistaken here. I don't know if this picture here shows all of them there. Normally the ones with the white helmets on are those that are part of the Syrian Civil Defense team. I believe he is with the sticker on the back of his helmet there. But the thing is, they did a good thing. Remember, they fired the guy. They said he went against their plans, that we're not supposed to do that. It says here, a volunteer rescue group in Syria that is subject of an Academy Award-winning film has fired one of its members after he was caught handling the corpses of fighters who supported the Syrian government. Syrian Civil Defense, commonly referred to as the White Helmets, released a statement Tuesday announcing it had dismissed one of its volunteers over a gross breach of the group's codes in the southeastern Syrian governorate of Dara. The statement came in response to an extremely graphic video shared on social media that featured a man in a White Helmets t-shirt assisting the armed militants in disposing of the mutilated corpses of fighters aligned with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. So it's definitely not the picture they have up here, right? I didn't want to show you that. I guess not. Like in this article right here. This one here, I'll save it for you to look at. It's an investigation, White Helmets committing acts of terror across Syria, how they began their funding. It says here, it was established in March 2013 by the British ex-military officer with $300,000 in seed funding from Japan, the UK, and the US. Well, I'm sorry, did they say a volunteer? Please. What about on this case here on Facebook here? Here's another one of your White Helmets. I don't even want to call them Syrians. President Bashar al-Assad said that there was 35 different nationalities fighting against his country. You just saw where Henry Lohendorf, right, was talking about the propaganda that we're being fed here in the West that is unprecedented to anything else that's ever been done. In this particular Facebook images here, they show a multitude of white helmets. And according to their charter, they're unarmed. Well, this white helmet member here runs around with a, looks like a .60 caliber machine gun. This white helmet guy right here, he's got his scoped rifle, not sure exactly which particular caliber that is, with his nice Al-Qaeda friends. Same thing with this white helmet's carrying his nice machine gun. This white helmet guy with his machine gun fighting on the lines there. They shouldn't have put this one up. Just because he's got a sword don't mean nothing. This one right here as well, the white helmet's band sticker is at the top right there. He's got an RPG in his hand. That's the white helmets. And there's hundreds of pictures that have exposed what they're up to. And in fact, this one right here is going to be one you won't forget. You remember this young man right here? Wow, the white helmets really became famous with this propaganda picture right here. This boy's parents, and believe me, it was really a bombing that happened at the house where his family lived. His brother did later die. But the white helmets used this young man as propaganda. There were many media groups that recognized something was amiss about that. They rush him into the van, put him down, nobody's giving the kid first aid, they all back up, and that's where they made their mistake. There were other photographs that show everybody standing at the back of the van taking pictures of the kid, taking video footage of the kid. What about treating the child that has been in a bombing? And of course they claimed Russian planes were flying overhead and dropping bombs. Well, interesting. Again, as Henry Lohendorf pointed out, the mass propaganda, right? Well, looky here. This was reported here on which let me get the article that we're in. The Independent, Aleppo's boy in the ambulance, Omran Daknish, safe and well in newly emerged footage. Little boy who epitomized the hell of Russian-backed Syrian government bombing of rebel-held East Aleppo appears in good health and is now living in regime-held territory. You know, I hate the way they just call it regime. It was a legitimate government at one time. I guess maybe people have forgot about that. You know, and let me tell you something, friend. I'm not here to be biased with you. I want to be honest with you. I don't have any agendas here. I got to tell you the truth. But here he is right here. He doesn't seem to have any scars or anything from what I can tell. I'm not saying that he wasn't injured, but nothing that seemed to be life-threatening. It says right here, new photos and video have surfaced, and his name is actually Omran Daknish, the little boy whose bloody, dusty face became a symbol of civilian suffering during the siege of Aleppo last year. Omran's family talked to Syrian state media and Pan-Arab Al-Mayadeen TV in interviews broadcast on Monday. In the footage, Omran is healthy and well, cuddling his father, siblings playing with a ball, and waving a Syrian regime flag. Okay? Goes on to say, the interviews are the first time the little boy has been in the public eye since photos of the video of him in the back of the White Helmet's ambulance after an airstrike shook the world in August 2016. His older brother Ali later died of wounds sustained in the same bombing. Speaking to reporters, Omran's father said that the family had refused interviews with pro-opposition outlets and kept a low profile until the siege barricades fell at the end of last year and the family crossed into government-held territory. Why do they want to go to government-held territory? Maybe because they really are Syrians.